Hi folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back. My name is Kat. I'm a licensed registered dietitian nutritionist. One of the things I've been seeing quite frequently, it might just be my algorithm, but more and more talk and understanding and just recognition of how various kinds of neurodivergency can impact application and the recommendations for application when it comes to anything, but especially health actions, health related actions, things that support physical health, but that also don't negatively impact those other aspects of health that are just as important, like mental, social, and emotional well-being. I think a lot more people are becoming aware of neurodivergency, and so I just really wanted, as a dietitian who is neurodivergent, I wanted to just kind of bring this conversation here on YouTube in my space, because it has been something that really has impacted my practice. A lot of the coaching side of things, the application side of things has been heavily impacted by this. And in the dietitian space, I think more dietitians especially are becoming aware of just how they can support their own neurodivergency, but then also their clients, just depending on, what's going on. And at that same time, I have seen some dietitians kind of take all or nothing stances and approaches and kind of invalidated other dietitians' own lived experience. So we're going to talk about various things when it comes to neurodivergency, but specifically focusing on some of the application, practical kind of things that have helped my neurodivergent clients and also myself. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment that down below. I will be briefly discussing diagnosis, but on the super brief and very surface level area, because that is not my area of expertise. And so I'll mostly be talking about nutrition. All right, so just kind of rewinding back, what is neurodivergency? So that is a term that is used to describe just various differences in how the brain works. So this could be differences in thinking and communication and learning, and also in the processing of sensory information. For some, these differences are just that. It's just a variation, a variation in how they experience the world. But for others, including myself, sometimes it feels, depending on the situation, it can feel very challenging, especially in spaces where that accommodation is just not there. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that kind of duality. It's not something that I would necessarily, I've seen some people say it is my superpower, but then some other people saying it's actually really challenging, and I tend to fall more in that space. But at the same time, if you feel like it is your superpower, I don't want to invalidate that either. But a really important note is that, and I'll discuss more about the differences, but no, even within the same actual diagnosis, because neurodivergency itself is not the diagnosis, it's just a term that's really popular right now. But even within the same diagnosis, one person's experience is not, the whole group is not a monolith. Everybody can have various experiences. There are general things that we can consider, but ultimately individual needs should be tailored. One of the questions that I hear is, well, wouldn't everybody be neurodivergent because everybody, experiences things differently? But it is specifically talking about meaningful differences in how those various things are processed, how the brain functions, or how it processes information. It's outside of the expected range that it would be in for a neurotypical kind of brain. It's not just a little quirk, here and there having some differences, but it's those things that can make it really challenging, especially if there are no accommodations, either in the environment or internally, recognizing those differences and then having tools and plans of actions for those. It stands out as something needing some additional support. And so sometimes I feel someone might hear something that a neurodivergent person feels is heavily tied to their neurodivergency, and that person will just kind of invalidate it and say everybody does that, or I didn't know that was specifically a fill in the blank kind of symptom or anything. But it's so much deeper than that. And when someone kind of mentions something like that, an example example, it's probably tied to multiple other things as well. And so it's not just like a one-off thing. And just because you do something that a neurodivergent person has identified as something that is like heavily tied to their neurodivergency, it doesn't automatically mean that the other person is neurodivergent. This is starting to get a little bit confusing, but again, I'm not a mental health professional. I am not someone who is ever in the space of diagnosing a neurodivergency. So like, go listen to someone else. But typically when that diagnosis is going on, they might use that professional, that mental health professional, the licensed professional, they will use various different things, questionnaires, behavioral assessments, using like standardized criteria from the DSM-5. And there can be like variable or multiple ones going on. There can be ones that might sometimes look like one thing, but it's really another thing. The formal diagnosis can be really helpful because it can allow for a little bit more accommodation, like benefits to accommodations. It can also help with some evidence-based care. However, seeking out getting that diagnosis, it's not accessible for many people for a variety of reasons. One, the fact of like health coverage, insurance, and even if it is covered, it might take several sessions, and that might be challenging to even schedule those sessions, might be long wait lists, or might not be anybody like with availability who are like that's their specialty in your area. There's cultural stigmas and just limited support sometimes for that formal diagnosis and accessibility issues. And so because of that, there is quite a bit of self-diagnosis going on. Now, there is controversy around that. I fully understand why that is happening though, because of the lack of accessibility. And when people have really see themselves and their experiences in other people who have that formal diagnosis or like various formal diagnoses, that can really help them with the application, with gathering the tools to maybe do similar kind of supportive things. It's not going to get them any of the, like if there is any necessary medication, it's not going to be enough to cover that, but it can help with some of that just like daily activities of living, even if it's not a formal diagnosis. Like the practical strategy kind of things, the understanding of the information processing even, and just like recognizing things that make a whole lot of sense when that person looks back on their entire life. Really that self-diagnosis, I feel like, can increase self-awareness and provide some tools to apply things maybe a little bit more effectively. And so I do know that there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. And when we're talking about neurodivergency, that could be anything from ADHD and the various types of that, or someone could be on the autism spectrum, someone could be dyslexic, have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, there could be other sensory processing disorders, and those are just some of them. There's more. And you might also be wondering, like, why are we hearing about neurodivergency overall more? Again, maybe it's just my algorithm, but I think more people are becoming more aware of that. And I think a big reason for that is a lot of cultural shifts. So people are more comfortable with talking about mental health, and like several years ago, that was, more information becoming more like on the rise with that. And then that has kind of led to other things being more openly spoken about, like neurodivergency. There's also the diagnostic tools and the resources, the research that has been helpful for like the diagnosis part of it. So years back, let's say like 80s, 90s, ADHD, that even has evolved quite a bit, because it used to be thought of as like this white male having ADHD. And that was like that was what all the information was about, or most of it. Like it was primarily diagnosed in white males. And so other populations that have previously been overlooked are like still overlooked, but are being more included in that information, in that research. There's also, I think, generational awareness. So more children just have better access to healthcare. I know for me, like my toddler sees the dentist regularly, and that's, you know, even something that I had only been to the dentist like one time as a kid kind of thing, like, and that was normal. And I would only go to the doctor really when it was I needed to get like vaccinations for school, but like he goes consistently and stuff like that, and that's not, I was very well taken care of, but it was just the, I think, support, especially even like in schools and stuff, is just different than what it used to be. And because a lot of neurodivergency is genetically tied, sometimes I think the parents, once their child receives a diagnosis or there's something suspected by their providers, like by their teachers and things, it can kind of lead that parent to think about things a little bit differently, like looking back on their childhood. I mean, like, okay, things make a little bit more sense now. It kind of can help explain lifelong challenges that were just kind of overlooked, things that were not understood previously. And just overall, there's increased visibility, and I think just people sharing their experiences, that there's more awareness, and the diagnostic tools and the support are just improving, which is what we want. We want people to get the support that they need. And so if that number of the amount of people who have various kinds of neurodivergency, if that goes up, then it goes up. That is fine. People are getting the support that they need. That's the most important, in my opinion. The ultimate goal, though, I see it as the same. The goals of more self-awareness and more tools to navigate life effectively. And like, if that's what it is, then like that's gonna help people, right? And like, I don't see why we want to like limit that. If somebody is going towards wanting to be just more self-aware and being able to navigate their life a little bit more effectively, I think that is something we should support. And again, I just want to reiterate that one person's experience is not going to be the same as another person's experience who has the exact same diagnosis, even on the formal level. There's the spectrum, and not everybody's the same. Now, with that all being said, let's dive into more of like the dietitian side of things. Now, neurodivergency can impact one's intake pretty significantly in a variety of different ways. It's not that all of these are going to happen at once, but these are different ways how neurodivergency can impact one's own nutrition or their like eating habits. It's not just shaped by hunger, and we will get into that because that is a huge topic to talk about. But challenges, things like sensory sensitivities or executive function, it can make those kind of routine tasks a little bit more challenging. Things like meal prep or even grocery shopping might feel a little bit too overwhelming, or just what is involved in it sensory wise, it can be overstimulating. Things like, and depending on the person too, they might have rigid routines that can make things more challenging, or reduced body awareness that adds on layers of complexity. There could be emotional factors. There could also be medication interactions where it might help someone with the executive functioning kind of thing, the doing, but it might reduce the appetite awareness. So let's go into each of those individually. So I'm going to go first briefly over how those different areas can impact nutrition, and then I will talk more about, really important note, about neurodivergency and eating disorders. I'll also discuss some comorbidities and neurodivergency, and then like tools for managing nutrition. Talk about some supplements, some of the misinformation around some of those. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, and you might see me refer to my notes. It's because I want to make sure that I stay on target. Okay, so with sensory sensitivities, some textures for some like mushy, or if some things are even like a yogurt kind of texture, or really any texture, or like temperature can be an issue. Smells as well, strong smells. Having like sensory sensitivities can lead to like food restriction, and food restriction can lead to a decrease in food variety, right? Obviously, but decrease in the nutrient variety of intake. And so long term, when we have typically less variety of foods, we're at an increased risk for various deficiencies. And that's one of the things why, like in dieting culture, there is that recommendation to, well, I mean, there is a recommendation to eat like very little, but on like the dietitian side, to not restrict, because we don't want to restrict and put ourselves at an increased risk for deficiencies. But not related to like intentional dieting or anything, we can also see this with sensory sensitivities. And so addressing this would be just finding sensory friendly ways of that intake, modifying foods to make them more palatable. This is a very individualized like space when it comes to sensory sensitivities. There might also be those executive functioning challenges. So executive function, that refers to the brain's ability to plan, organize, and execute tasks. For someone with neurodivergency, sometimes any of those or all of those areas can be extra challenging. The difficulty starting tasks, difficulty staying focused, staying on task, difficulty completing the task, managing those decisions, it can be a lot. And with meal planning, if you think about all the different steps, there's a lot that goes on with meal planning, and you have to do that every single week, and you have to eat every single day, multiple times a day. It's just a lot. And so because of this, that's why there might be more of that like restriction, less variety. There could be more of a like intake of lower nutrient density foods, really easy foods to put together that have lower nutritional quality and variety of micronutrients. And so something like meal planning, while it can be so helpful, can be so challenging. And so this is where, again, depending on the person, that'll, determine what would be best. But sometimes having apps that will break down things for you can be helpful. Having that plan of care, that plan of action for that individual can be really helpful. And that's what I would work on one-on-one with that person. I'll go into more details of like the tools. Right now, I'm just wanting to talk about just how it can impact nutrition. One of the other things that can impact nutrition is hyperfocus and forgetting. So someone can be really in an intense time where they're getting so much done and being very productive and have their creativity going on, but they might not either hear or feel hunger cues, and they might just kind of continue to do that action at hand and not eat until much later in the day. So that could look like skipped meals or eating at irregular times, even this kind of cycle of fatigue with energy crashes, which in a cycle can affect focus overall. So it's it can be a really challenging cycle. And so for that, it's essential to find ways of incorporating food into that without taking that person out of that like ability to get the work done, right? We want to work with them and not make them pull themselves away, because that's not sustainable, that's not realistic, that's not fun either. There might also be some emotional eating or like restrictive eating, just like in response to stress, to overstimulation, just as you might see that in neurotypical folks. We know that food can be a way of just kind of self-soothing and getting someone's mind off of things. Comfort foods, those might feel like more immediately rewarding, more enjoyable. On the other side, there might be some stress and overwhelm that might lead to food aversion and that kind of restrictive under eating. And both of those can have impacts on someone's health, their overall well-being as well. Something else that might impact nutrition is or our routines and rigidity. And so if somebody has like a sudden change in their routine, if they're traveling or with work or whatever, that can make it already for like a neurotypical person can also be challenging, right? But it might really throw someone off as someone who is neurodivergent. And again, that's not to say that, neurotypical people can't experience these things as well, but just go back to the beginning and how I broke that down. It can make things significantly more challenging. The predictability of similar meals, similar foods, having safe foods, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but that can be really what that person thrives on. And so if there is a limited variety and there is a very rigid schedule and very consistent food intake with little variety, you can add more stress to that person with the idea of even having more variety and maybe switching things up a little bit. So that can absolutely be something that can impact nutrition. Now, one of the other big ways how neurodivergency can impact nutrition is with reduced interoceptive awareness. So interoceptive awareness is essentially just being aware of various things going on within the body. So like hunger cues, typical what a lot of people think of as hunger cues of the stomach growling, that would be interoceptive awareness. Also feeling your heart beat faster, if you almost get into an accident or something and then you have this feeling. And so if you have a reduced interoceptive awareness, those hunger cues can be not there, or they can be lowered down. They might be confusing. And so because of this might lead to skipped meals during the day. And then afterwards, when maybe those hunger cues are at a higher intensity, it might lead to consumption past fullness, consumption where you are excessively full, you're not comfortable, and this kind of just binge restrict cycle, especially if those fullness cues are also reduced. And this is where having some kind of external tools can be helpful, those kind of reminders on the phone to eat, having really simple meals and snacks available, and maybe that's also having pre-portioned out meals to, of course, not for a restrictive kind of way of if you're still hungry, you're not allowed to have more, but have this is, a good amount and appropriate amounts. If you need more, then that's okay too, but we're gonna at least have this. Now, really big caveat to this, or really big side note to this, one of my biggest frustrations, which is totally understandable that some people see it as this, but hunger cues are not just the stomach growling. That is not it. Hunger cues can be reduced focus. It can be also feeling lower energy, having less energy. It could be feeling a little tired, less ability to maintain a happy kind of effect, or a little bit quicker to snap or anything. Even feeling shaky. Hunger is so much more than just physical hunger in your stomach. And I actually, and it took me years to kind of realize this, but when I was a kid, teenager and stuff, I would often get really shaky, and I didn't know why necessarily. One time, I think when I was in my early 20s, I had asked a doctor about that, and they had said it was a reactive hypoglycemia, but it turned out that I was just hungry and not eating enough. And it took me forever, years later, to realize, oh, that was one of the signs. And even though when I would get hungry enough, and I would still eat, but for me, I recognize those other more subtle signs of hunger before I do stomach hunger. And so once I really started diving into intuitive eating and becoming aware of those non-stomach hunger cues, I recognize those other signs of hunger, and unknowingly, that was one of the approaches, or one of the things that really started with just recognizing the differences in neurodivergency, and recognizing that we can't just rely on our like stomach hunger, because sometimes it's not there or it's much less noticeable. And so once I started becoming more aware of those other signs of hunger, I have not gotten shaky. Moving into the next section, is it neurodivergency or is it an eating disorder? So sometimes from the outside, they can look very similar. They can overlap. For those who are, let's say someone has ADHD and they're really like having challenges with executive functioning, or someone who has like sensory sensitivities, or someone is like in a hyperfocus state, they might not eat the entire day and then consume something later on, but they're not restricting for the same reasons as someone with, let's say, anorexia nervosa. In eating disorders like anorexia, like bulimia, what we see is that they are often tied to body image as well as control over one's body. And even though a neurodivergency can have that kind of restrictive eating, it's not we're not gonna see it for those body image issues. And that's not to say that someone who has a neurodivergency can't also have anorexia nervosa. Like, those might overlap at times, but just because someone is not eating for the whole day doesn't necessarily mean that they have like anorexia nervosa, for example. So some key differences, like there might be sensory preferences versus food rules. So that individual, the neurodivergent individual, might not eat because of sensory preferences versus someone with I'll talk about ARFID in a second. So hold on, before you start to comment, I did not forget about ARFID. We'll talk about that. But someone with a more, what you think about with an eating disorder, those kind of safe foods are not safe because of sensory preferences, but they're safe because of food rules or like a diet rule. Another kind of thing is that someone has a very specific like snack food. They could be doing that because it is easy to grab. It's just super easy, versus someone else who might be choosing that because it's low calorie. There's also the difference between forgetting versus intentionally not consuming until a specific time. And it's really important to distinguish which one, for the practitioner to be aware of not just that restriction going on, but where is that coming from? Because the support is going to look completely different. For someone with an eating disorder, of course you'd want them working with an eating disorder specialist, but typically the program and support around that is going to focus on emotional distress, body image issues if they're there through therapy, versus someone with neurodivergence, we might focus on the sensory preferences or like the sensory overwhelm, executive functioning challenges, right? So like the application of addressing those issues, those challenges is going to be different. Now, I do want to talk about ARFID because that is an eating disorder. So ARFID stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. It's very different from anorexia nervosa or bulimia because it is not rooted in body image. Like their body image is not part of it. It's like, it's not the driving force. It's driven by other things like sensory sensitivities to food textures, temperature, flavor, smells as well. There can also be like a fear of negative consequences like choking or vomiting, burping even, fear of like allergic reactions to, just this kind of like strong aversion to certain groups of food or certain foods. There could also be just an overall like lack of interest in eating, like no motivation to eat consistently kind of thing. And usually like you'll see it in more of childhood, but it can also be triggered. I've like seen it be triggered in young adults, and it can lead to a lot of like distress in trying more foods and getting that food variety. And this is where really working with a team of health professionals is important, but specifically a registered dietitian who is aware of these kind of challenges, who isn't just gonna say you need to have more variety and then expect that person to include more variety. There needs to be a very intentional and just well-informed plan of action. And if left untreated, this kind of restriction can lead to a lot of challenges, of course, if you think about any kind of deficiencies, malnutrition, things like that. So it's really important that the person gets the appropriate care. And so this is where really having those sensory-friendly meals, having that kind of sensory-friendly environment, having a low-pressure environment, building trust, all of these little things are so important to the just support around that. Now, this leads us into the idea of safe foods. Now, safe foods are foods that are consistent, that provide that level of just they are familiar. They're familiar in taste, in texture, in experience, mouthfeel. They offer this kind of reassurance through that consistency. And this is why you typically don't see a lot of safe foods being like blueberries, for example, because blueberries, if you buy it one week, they can be super like juicy and sweet, and then the next week be very tart and like hard, right? Like it's not the same as like a cracker that is manufactured to always taste the same and always feel the same. Now, on top of that, if it's not so much a sensory related thing, it could also be a safe food because it is something that does provide you satisfaction and is also like super easy, really accessible options. Safe foods can be a way of just kind of coping when there's like overstimulation going on. You just know it's there, it's a safe option. Something else that's also important is the idea of stimming, or that kind of like self-stimulation to soothe. So sometimes the chewing itself can be a stimming kind of activity. Eating can be a stimming. Sometimes it's with like specific textures, like something crunchy or something chewy, something that is providing a kind of sensory experience that they might do in order to self-soothe depending on the situation. It could be like in a low stress situation, they could still do it, but also like in a higher stress situation where they might seek that out a little bit more like intently. Now, if somebody is stimming with food specifically, someone, a practitioner or just someone on the other side or outside might see that as emotional eating, but it might not be the emotions that are causing the eating necessarily. Like the food is serving a sensory purpose. It's not necessarily the emotions that are driving that eating. And so again, it's just something to be aware of, to know, because what the response is or what the recommendation or the plan of action will look like is going to be different, and it should be different depending on where that's coming from, even though on the outside it might look the same. Now, there are some comorbidities. So I always mess up that word. So comorbidities, those are just other things that can be like conditions going on alongside. We see kind of like correlation with things. With neurodivergency, we can see IBS related kind of symptoms come up, anxiety, depression, and that can be for a variety of reasons. Sleep disorders come up, and then also certain parts of like a menstrual cycle. So there is some like interesting more research coming out about this, how especially in like the luteal phase, when estrogen goes down, it can be a little bit more challenging, or you can see those like executive functioning challenges become more of a challenge. And then also like during menopause and beyond, that like reduced estrogen might also impact and make those like challenges even more of a challenge. And so you just want to be aware of that. And going back to kind of like the IBS, when we were talking about it, it might make sense for that person, like the most evidence-based thing might be to do, let's say, a low FODMAP like protocol, low FODMAP diet, which is not meant to be long-term, but that might be the most appropriate thing for that case. However, if those foods that are high in FODMAPs are that person's safe foods, you're gonna need to layer on multiple different factors. Being aware of those other comorbidities is important as a like individual receiving care, and also for anybody who is giving care. Okay, so now let's talk about more of the tools for helping support nutrition in neurodivergency. Again, this is gonna be very individualized when you're working with someone one-on-one. There are a lot of different things, a lot of different tools. There's things like medication, sensory management tools, time time and organization tools, emotional regulation strategies, and then nutrition specific strategies. And so I'll go through all of them. The medication, super briefly, I just wanted to put that in there because it is technically a tool. Not everybody is going to be using those, but they can be really helpful. And I just want people to really, like, I feel like sometimes people can feel like it's, I don't know, they just kind of feel guilty for having to use the medication, but nobody would, or I wouldn't think anybody would. Like, if someone had diabetes and they need insulin, for example, like nobody's gonna shame you for needing insulin, right? Like, your body needs, like, physically it needs it. And so on the neurodivergent side, if it is something that your healthcare provider, your doctor, your physician has recommended and you've tried it and it's been helpful, like, you do you. Right? The only thing with medication that I will say is that sometimes it can reduce appetite awareness on top of maybe reduced appetite awareness, right? And so it can be really helpful to, for the executive functioning side of things, for getting tasks done. But we just want to make sure that we're incorporating other tools like those timers, for example, to make sure that you're eating, that you're getting some kind of nourishment in. So for the sensory management tools, moving on to that, the goal for that is to reduce overstimulation in, whatever way that it's coming in. So some strategies might include the texture modifications, whether that is including, like, sometimes people might include more like vegetables into like a pasta sauce to get more of that variety, or it could be also like if somebody is needing a little bit more protein and it makes sense to have like a Greek yogurt, in the afternoon, but they really don't like that texture, maybe incorporating some cereal in there or granola, some fruit in there, things to help with that texture. That also would be a form of texture modification. There's also the idea of just creating a sensory friendly environment. So if you have a favorite fork, a favorite spoon, favorite plate or bowl, using those just to kind of help overall reduce, again, that overstimulation if that's there. Someone might also use noise canceling headphones in this space, or dim some of the lights, dim some of the sound as well, or increase the sound, increase, having the TV on or scrolling or something to just kind of get the mind off of like this intense focus of food. Which, that as a side note, I know there is that recommendation in just the mindful eating space, to reduce distractions, but sometimes that can be helpful for some people to include that distraction just to kind of get in that nourishment and not be trying to focus so much on the food. You could also think about sensory friendly clothes. So if you are going to have a meal and somebody is maybe a little bit more fearful of burping or vomiting, then having something that's a little bit looser, a little bit more comfortable. And that could also be while you're eating, but then I know sometimes people like to use a weighted blanket. I love weighted blankets. I think they help just sensory wise too, but you wouldn't really use that while you're eating, but just in general. Now, another kind of category of tools might be like organization tools. Now with this, I want to say too that it is okay if you use one kind of organizational tool for like a month or less, any kind of time frame. But if it stops working for you after a month, that is okay. It was still successful for that month. So if you need to switch up strategies every month, that is okay. That is a win because you are having that self-awareness and doing something, being able to do something about it. So if you're using an app for meal planning and then you just stop using it one day, you can use it maybe later down the line, but you can start using another you can use an Excel sheet if you want. You can switch around. But apps like Yumly or Meal Lime, those can be helpful if we're just kind of organizing, giving you ideas. and then providing like the grocery list, things like that. Smart Cooks is one that I will use sometimes, and I love it because it'll tell me like, it'll give me 4 recipes for like dinner, and then also like the groceries and stuff, and I just follow it. But I won't do that all the time. It just kind of depends on the week, and I haven't done it for a while, but I was doing it like every week earlier this year, especially at the end of like last year. I was using it a lot. Yeah, it depends kind of just on like the schedule. More recently with like childcare especially, that I've been using it a little bit less, just like with the timing and with the gym and stuff like that. This might also be where we have a specific plan of action for meal planning. Something that's not too overwhelming, right? Like you're not gonna make all your meals and all your snacks and just like create them looking perfectly like for Pinterest or Instagram or whatever. It might just be cooking 2 kinds of proteins, like you're making ground beef and you're putting some chicken in the crock pot, and then you're also having 2 kinds of fiber dense carbohydrates. So maybe you're roasting some sweet potatoes and you're cooking some rice on the stovetop, and like throughout the week you can mix and match those kind of things. It could also be like utilizing veggie trays where you don't have to do any veggie preparation, or it could be using those kind of like salad kits to make things a little bit easier. You could use more of those like ready to eat components as well, like the microwavable rice packs. And there's so many different blends too, with like quinoa and other kind of grains as well. There's also time management tools. So if you wanted to use something like to-do list or Todoist or Notion, Google calendars for the actual timing, you could also do like a Pomodoro technique or whatever that's called. What is it called? Pomodoro method, where you'll work for like 25 minutes and then have 5 minutes break. Usually like I'll go into the intention of doing that, but then those 5 minutes I'll still like be focused on that, but it's just like getting started. You could also do something like body doubling. So for work, I use Flown. It's a little bit pricey. It was something that I did pay for because of how much I use it and how helpful it is. But that is really cool because you can just kind of drop in at any time and you'll have like other people. It's kind of like a Zoom, but it's not Zoom, and you're just working with other people. One of my other favorite tools is Goblin.tools, and that one you put in like the task, and then it'll break down all the different steps. And if one of the steps feels a little bit too overwhelming or anything, you can click and that'll break down the steps even more so. So there's also like if you wanted to do like a cue to start, especially with more of that like executive functioning challenge, sometimes people find it helpful to have like house shoes, not like a typical slipper comfy kind of house shoe, but like shoes that you would wear outside, but they're only for inside, so they're clean. But once you put those on, then you start to clean, or then you start to do meal prep, then you start to like do the actual work. So sometimes having some kind of like sensory cue or ritual around that can be helpful. The goal of whatever the tool is, ultimately the goal is to reduce the decision amount, like the decision fatigue, and to just create this kind of like stress-free, approachable way to eating and nourishment in a way that's going to support physical health and also not harm those other aspects of health, like mental, social, and emotional well-being. There can also be more of like emotional self-regulation tools. So if somebody finds benefit in like journaling, they don't have to just kind of like sit and journal if that is not something that they can really focus on. If it makes more sense for that person to go on a walk and verbally process, that can also, like, you can consider that as journaling. You're just doing it in a different way. It looks a little bit different. Same thing with like meditation. You can do, or like breath work, for example. It can be challenging for sometimes people to sit and really focus on their breath. It can be a little bit overwhelming too. And so doing breath work in like walking, not necessarily holding your breath in that same way, but just like having that kind of like awareness to it, or awareness of when your feet touch the ground. There are so many different ways of bringing in mindfulness that don't have to be like the traditional kind of neurotypical way if that has not worked for you. And some kind of like tracking of just even tracking like emotions, feelings, those can also kind of help to bring to light some like consistencies that you see happening, like some challenges. For example, like uncovering patterns of if they know that they don't have their timed snack in the afternoon, then they start to feel a little bit more anxious, or they might feel a little bit more overwhelmed, just various things. And then like just uncovering those patterns and recognizing, oh, when I don't have that snack and I don't have that alarm turned on, I don't feel the best. And then I overconsume past comfort and, you know, not a good time kind of thing. So just uncovering those kind of patterns can be helpful, and something that can be done through something like tracking, through something like journaling. And it doesn't need to look like you're sitting in a corner, like doing breath work. Ultimately, meal planning can be so helpful. It can be helpful for reducing decision making, like of the day. It can help to reduce stress as well. If you know you already have that meal, the food prepared, ready to go, it can help with that executive dysfunction if you can get it done at one time with those kind of tools, those sensory cues, versus expecting that to be done every day. It can reduce some food waste. It can help support health goals. And one of the more kind of challenges that I see with meal prepping is that sometimes like you might not be in the mood for that meal, and that is okay. This is where really utilizing the freezer and having like individual portions of meals or like sides or something can be helpful when you make something, so that if you have this kind of prepped meal but you're not in the mood for it, you have those other options in the freezer as well. And that just comes from small little like doing that and putting it in the freezer kind of thing. You're building it up over time. You're not just expected to do everything like all at once. Now, with the whole idea about mindfulness, I didn't mention, though I wanted to, about how sometimes there might be like a over like awareness of the like senses. And so if you're asking someone to sit and be with their senses, that can be a little bit overwhelming. Or if somebody is under aware of those senses, it can be a little bit frustrating if you ask them to sit with them and they're not really like feeling those senses or like experiencing those senses. And so that might be where you might do like a specific sense, like we're going to, like with this meal, with the first few bites, we're just going to think about the texture. We're just going to be mindful of the taste. Or you're doing that with like a walking, kind of bringing sensory awareness to like you're walking. Now we're going to focus on like the rhythm of the step, the feel of the ground, the sensation of the air, different kind of more like movement mindfulness applications. Ultimately, mindfulness can be done in like bursts of time. It can be like 1 to 2 minutes. It does not mean that you're sitting there being mindful. Like it does not need to look a specific kind of way. The goal of mindfulness is to help bridge the sensory awareness, that kind of building of that skill. Sometimes it might not increase, sometimes it might, just depends on the person. But remember that that doesn't, like mindfulness, bringing awareness to like hunger and fullness cues, that doesn't need to just be the stomach. And it probably won't be. That is okay. It is okay if it is not stomach related hunger, if you don't feel that. All right, so another really big thing that I wanted to talk about that is pretty controversial is the idea of intuitive eating versus mechanical eating. So intuitive eating, we've talked about it a lot on this channel. I am a supporter of the intuitive eating framework. It has helped me in so many different ways. And the challenge is that one of the challenges is that it's kind of thought of as what it sounds like. And intuitive eating itself is an actual framework. There are principles, and it is described as a dynamic interplay of instinct, emotion, and rational thought. And that rational thought piece is often forgotten about when people are kind of more criticizing it. Now, mechanical eating, on the flip side, it is structured. You're going to be eating at a specific time regardless of if you're hungry or not. It can be used in like an eating disorder space, for example. And it can be helpful, let's say if somebody is on a medication that reduces their appetite, to have those kind of like timings, those alarms on the phone in order to eat, even if they're not necessarily aware of those more subtle hunger cues at the time. So with mechanical eating, you're eating every 3 to 4 hours, regardless of hunger cues. Now, this is important because it can help with mood, it can help stabilize blood sugar levels, energy overall. And at the same time, you're not like ever like locked into like any specific way of eating. You could use that more so, especially if somebody is like taking medication, they might rely on that more so during the day. And then once the medication wears off, they might rely more so on like an intuitive eating approach. Now, as I was talking about with intuitive eating, it is a dynamic interplay of instinct, which can be those hunger and fullness cues. But remember, hunger and fullness is not just stomach. It can be those subtle signs as well. And with the other part of that, the instinct, emotion, and rational thought piece, that is really where we can make informed choices about nutrition and what works for that person. That is really where the application of intuitive eating comes into play with any kind of medical nutrition therapy. I see them as both focusing on nourishment, body kindness, ultimately, more so than being like rigid diet rules. They both encourage eating without shame, without guilt, and promotes a healthy relationship with food. I think that there's a misunderstanding. I feel like sometimes people think that mechanical eating is like purely external and there is zero room for any kind of like internal, like with any like intention or anything, or like intuition. And I think that sometimes with intuitive eating, it can be seen as like purely internal without any kind of structure. And that is just not the case when you look at the principles. They can really complement each other and they can both be flexible. I think there are strengths to both, and I think when we can combine both of those can be really helpful. And I just see like controversy with the idea of intuitive eating in the neurodivergent kind of space with dietitians because of like lived experience, and at the same time invalidating other dietitians who are neurodivergent and their lived experience. And one of the things that I think is just so important is to not have these kind of like all or nothing, black or white kind of approaches. And I mean, that's like across my channel. What I talk about often is that there is so much nuance with nutrition and the application of things. And so I'm just not a fan of completely being against intuitive eating for neurodivergency because it requires so much nuance. And I think that to do so is to not use a word like so many times, because I've said it so many times before, but it is really invalidating to say that it should not be recommended in a neurodivergent space. There just needs to be nuance, right? But I think that's also part of just social media, of being like very divisive and being like all or nothing kind of thing. And so that's really where my message of nuance gets kind of buried. All right, so moving into the next section, we're talking about nutrition on the different kind of chemicals, right? So dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, we need to eat in order to like have our bodies live, right? And so the building blocks of these also come from foods. They can come from foods. Like dopamine, for example, it's made from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. Serotonin is made from tryptophan, which is another amino acid. And so we need to eat protein for so many different reasons, but one of those reasons is for neurotransmitter production. We need to eat carbohydrates because our brains, it uses glucose, so much glucose. And so if we're having very low carbohydrate intake, that can impact a focus and make those challenges even more of a challenge. And we also need fats, of course, for brain structure as well, for brain health. And so as far as application wise, we're still going to have that same kind of meal formula that you would see neurodivergent or neurotypical. And I'll put an example of kind of the application of that, but we're going to still want to have protein, carbohydrates, fiber if we can, especially helpful for digestive health. And then we also want to have healthy fats on that plate as well, somewhere on that plate. And so these are just like examples of how you can approach different meals, but the portion of these can change based on activity level, personal preference, personal needs as well. So this is just like a starting place. One of the things that I also will provide, and that I have like a blog article on this, and I have like a download, but just the different examples of lower energy requiring meals, and then like more moderate ones, just things that you can put together to make a meal balanced out, giving some protein, carbohydrates, fats that are a little bit easier to do. So that might be helpful, especially on days where it's a little bit more challenging to get like more intense meal preparation done. All right, so really briefly, I want to talk about some of the supplements because I get some questions on this. L-theanine is one I think is becoming more popular. I think we will start to see that more. So that is an amino acid. It's found naturally in like green tea. It's one of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of green tea, but for me, and this is personal experience, so anecdotal evidence, right? I find that it really helps with focus, and it works really well with caffeine, the little caffeine that is in green tea as well. But it's not just that anecdotal evidence. There is research that it can have some benefits in regards to that kind of focus and attention, mood kind of support. So it's something that, if you wanted to try it, I would recommend having some green tea, a few cups a day, just kind of see. There's also something that I've been seeing is methylated folate. So someone who has some gene mutations, they might not be getting if they're getting in enough like folate, for example, or folic acid, it might not be as utilized if there is some kind of like genetic mutation. So if somebody has a deficiency, then they're going to see like more symptoms on top of that. But it's not, I would say, for everyone. Like it's popular on social media, but more research is needed for that one specifically. That would be like where it comes from, what I found was a case study, and I believe it was a very like small case study, and it was a use of that with other like standard treatments on ADHD and autism. And it promoted like overall health in those with dietary gaps and like increased need for nutrients. So that is, again, one, more research is needed. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention, or other things, omega-3s. So the symptom improvement for neurodivergency in that is limited, but we know that omega-3s are just important for general brain health. And so if you can get that from fish, that is great. From salmon, for example, but sometimes that might not be like sensory-wise something that someone would like, or taste-wise. So that's where having like an omega-3 supplement might make sense for someone. Same thing with vitamin D. It's not directly tied, but a lot of people are deficient in it. And so if you could get your levels checked, that would be, just recommended in general. My camera said that it was too high of an internal temperature. And so it is what it is. And then one of the other supplements that is not causative, but we see a correlation, is with iron and ADHD, for example. Again, not causative, but if you have more of like fatigue, it's just something to kind of get checked. Iron supplementation is not something that you want to do without knowing where your levels are. So just something that can make symptoms a little bit more challenging on top of a deficiency. There's also GABA that I have been seeing on social media as well, and that also needs a little bit more research. There is some like controversy with that one as well, with how like effectively or not effectively it does with like the blood-brain barrier. So it's essentially a neurotransmitter, and some more research is needed on that one for me to feel and comfortable, recommending someone supplement with GABA. The neurotransmitter itself can help with the regulation of melatonin and serotonin, but again, it's the like effectiveness of the supplement in crossing the blood-brain barrier and some of the just kind of back and forth with that. So I would, more research is needed on that one. But ultimately though, there can be correlation with micronutrient deficiencies with all of those different reasons, when we went through the list of why someone or how neurodivergency can impact nutrition, if there is that limited variety, then yeah, we might see those deficiencies, but it's not the deficiency that's going to cure anything. Nothing needs that curing anyway. But I think sometimes the people think that, you know, it's just like this kind of supplement that'll fix everything, but it's really more about if there is something going on with lack of variety for whatever reason, we might need to supplement, but it's not going to, and it might impact some of the symptoms if it is making them a little bit more challenging, but to not expect them to be like this kind of magic pill or something like that. Okay, so overall, there is so much more that I can say about all of these different, especially the application. When we're talking about ARFID example, that, I mean, is its own video itself. And I've been talking to a couple of people who would find like a video like that to be helpful. So I might do an additional video, like a part 2 to this, where I talk more about application for that, because it really, you know, depends on the case, but there is a lot that we can kind of talk about with that. And so I just didn't want to make this like video that much more longer, but if that would be helpful, let me know if you would want that. Ultimately though, neurodivergency can impact nutrition in just various ways, and it's really important for dietitians to be aware of that, but then also for people who are neurodivergent and who think they are, who might see themselves reflected in any of these kind of areas, just that there are tools that we can utilize to help with ultimately what I want to help with, which is supporting physical health while also not harming those other aspects of health, and doing so in the most accessible way possible that we can. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a like if you liked it. Please make sure you're subscribed. I greatly appreciate that. And that's it. Remember, you can strive for health without subscribing to diet culture. I'll see you later. Bye.